Hello, Bio20, and welcome to our lesson on selective advantage and natural selection. Today, you are learning what natural selection is and how selective advantage can arise from mutations and how this advantage helps animals survive in an environment. So today, you need to be able to define the word selective advantage, explain how a mutation can give an organism a selective advantage, and then connect selective advantage to natural selection in a simulation activity. So selective advantage, let's start there. What is it? It's a characteristic that improves the likelihood of survival. So what that means is when an animal, human, or any organism is born, they literally have genetics from the parents that they came from. So 50% from each parent. Now, naturally, there are mutations that occur within your own DNA. And sometimes that mutation can lead to variation. So variation then allows us sometimes to be slightly different than our parents and then our siblings. And sometimes those variations can give us an advantage. So usually how this occurs is it's a result of a mutation in the DNA. This result of a mutation is usually due to some sort of changing environment around us. Now, they don't go hand in hand. Mutations occur random. So it's not like the environment changes so then you have a mutation. They happen randomly. But it's usually a pressure idea. So if you think about sickle cell anemia, we've kind of talked about sickle cell before. There was a pressure with malaria in Africa. Malaria is the parasite that is carried by mosquitoes. People who developed the mutation for sickle cell were not able to be infected with malaria. So that's a selective advantage. They have an advantage over people that do not have sickle cell. So that is a selective advantage, something that gives you a one-up, kind of something better within your environment. So here's the idea of sickle cell. So sickle cell, you can see here is where does sickle cell occur, 10 to 20%. This is the 5 to 10, this is the 1 to 5. And then you can see the epidemic of malaria. And you can see that where malaria lives the most is mostly where we see sickle cell anemia. So hand in hand, there was a pressure from the environment, and eventually a mutation arose that helped you live in that environment. So people that live in that area of Africa may have sickle cell anemia, which means that they won't catch malaria. People that travel to Africa need to make sure that they take some sort of vaccination shot in order to give them protection against malaria, because we do not have that selective advantage like the people that live there. So how does this play into natural selection? Well, natural selection is a process that results when you have characteristics of a population in the population of the organisms change, okay? So what that means is that you have generations, parent generation, offspring parent generation. You also have grandparent generations. And what we're looking for is changes that occur in each generation. So if you think about your grandparents, your parents, and your different generations, within your actual individual self, okay, you will not change throughout your lifetime. What you're born with is what's going to happen. But you will have inherited traits that allow you to survive in the environment that you live in. And then you pass these traits on to the offspring. So natural selection is looking for changes within each generation. How do those changes help them survive in the environmental conditions they are in? And then do those get passed on to the next generation? Big important part here is natural selection occurs over time. It does not allow for an individual to change in their lifetime. So we all know I'm quite short. In my lifetime, I will not be able to grow taller. Even though it might be an advantage in the world I live in, I'm not going to be able to grow taller, okay? My genes, hopefully, my short genes are not passed on to my offspring. Instead, a tall gene is passed from my husband, let's say. So you yourself do not change over time. But if you look at human populations as a whole, or if you look at Medicine Hat, or even if you look at the school, a population can change over time due to different genetics being passed on from one generation to the next. So let's look at what natural selection requires in order to occur. So natural selection requires that there's variation, so differences within the species, and that we have selective pressure. Selective pressure essentially means something we're choosing for or something we're choosing against. And I'll use that language over and over again, so please be aware that that's important to understand. Selected for and a selected against. So let's look at this picture right here. We got a bunch of birds and some beetles. Now you'll notice each of these birds are eating the green beetles because they taste delicious. Okay, they're the best tasting beetles you ever saw. Not only that, but these ones are kind of a brownish color, which maybe they blend a little bit better into the background. So they have some camouflage, maybe a little bit. So the green beetles are selected against, meaning they are most likely not surviving. The brown beetles, on the other hand, are being selected for, meaning they are going to pass on their genes and survive. So if we look at over time, what's going to happen to a population, this can happen over generations and generations. You'll notice we're eating the green beetles here. There's a few brown beetles. We're eating more green beetles, but now you'll notice that these 3 brown beetles pass their genetics on to another set of brown beetles. So now there's a new generation, and you're noticing that there's more brown beetles in the population. Again, time passes, and eventually we've selected against all the green beetles, and the brown beetles have now taken over. Now, these crows or these birds now have a choice. They can start eating the brown beetles because maybe they taste similar, maybe not as good, but maybe they taste similar, or they're going to have to find a new source of food. Now, that being said, some of these beetles may produce green offspring because they have the genetics for it. And that's hard to explain because that's more of a bio-30 idea. But these green beetles could produce these brown beetles may produce a green offspring somewhere along the line, maybe. So the crows may have something to eat. But essentially what we're saying is we're selected against when you die and you can't pass on your genetics, or you're selected for, meaning you're passing on your genetics. So selective pressures are the result of environmental conditions. We select for or we select against. If we're selecting for, we like the characteristics we see, there's a better chance of survival. If we're selecting against, it means there's less likely a chance of survival and you're not going to pass on those traits. An example of this is antibiotic resistance. So if you've ever been sick and you've been given antibiotics, it's important that you take it for the entire duration that you've been given. So 7 or 10 days, let's say. A lot of people start feeling better after about 5 or 6 days. So if you stopped taking your antibiotics before the doctor said you should, you could cause your body to go through something called antibiotic resistance. So what that means is viruses and bacteria are really, really, really good at mutating. They're very good at just having random mutations. So let's say you have strep throat and you start taking a bunch of antibiotics for it, and you kill almost all of the bacteria that are used for antibiotics. Okay. Issue is maybe there's a few of those little bacteria that are still hanging out that were resistant to the first round of those antibiotics. Only taking it for 5 days didn't kill them because they have a little mutation that makes it harder for us to kill them. So if you stop taking them right then and there, those bacteria could live in your body and reproduce more bacteria, and you could suffer from strep throat again. And this time taking antibiotics, they'd have to be stronger, or they would have to take them for longer because your body has now built up a resistance to it. There are certain bacteria out in the world that are completely resistant to most antibiotics. And that's because antibiotics were given out kind of like candy. Oh, you feel a little sick? Here, have some penicillin. You feel a little sick? Here, have this. And what ended up happening is our bacteria that were killed by these penicillins ended up becoming very resistant to them because people didn't know how to take them properly. So antibiotic resistance is a result for us selecting against bacteria, but then there was a mutation that caused them to survive. So then that's selecting for. The antibiotics can't kill them, and instead they are able to live on and pass on their genetics. So natural selection does not anticipate the change in the environment. It's not like natural selection can say, oh, hey, it's going to get warmer in the next couple years, so I'm going to make sure that you have blank available to you. It's not like that. It doesn't anticipate any changes in the environment. It is a result because the environment has changed. Adaptations are beneficial in some situations, but then can be completely silent or useless, meaning nothing happens, or they can actually be detrimental in other situations. So meaning we end up having an adaptation that's bad for us. So when we talk about natural selection and passing them on, we're usually looking at adaptations that are beneficial, not the other two. So last thing I want to quickly talk about is artificial is not natural. So you may hear the words natural selection and artificial selection, and this is something back from grade 9. Natural selection, again, is that idea of an advantage that is passed on down through the offspring that eventually allows for you to survive. Now, this says Lamarck's giraffe. Kind of ignore that because remember, we learned that Lamarck was all about the use and disuse. So it's saying, here's your short neck giraffe. And because it reached really high and higher and higher, it was able to stretch its neck long. That's not true. What we see here is a short neck giraffe, and it was able to reach these leaves. It had an offspring that had a little bit of a longer neck. This one maybe was here. So down generations, the neck got a little longer. Down later generations, that offspring, those parent generations passed on to offspring. Parent generations passed off to offspring. So this advantage of having a longer neck was passed through generations. That is natural selection. Artificial selection is deemed when we as humans intercede. So what we do is we look for things that are beneficial and then we breed them to get the best results. So for example, this is corn originally. Okay. Now what ended up happening is people were able to say, hey, I can breed corn and I can take different parts of their seeds and I can eventually make these really large modern day cobs of corn. They're bigger, they feed you better, the kernels are larger, there's more nutrition. So what they do is they take seeds from some of their best corn crops and then they put them together to try and even make a better corn crop. You can kind of think of it with puppies. Maybe of you own some sort of doodle. So meaning they don't really shed. So labradoodle, bernedoodle. There's so many different types of doodles, right? Sheep doodles, all those kinds of things. The idea is they take a poodle, which is not shedding, and breed it with a dog, and then you get a dog that has hopefully some genetics that you like, a dog that doesn't shed but is really big. You might see some things like that. That is artificial selection. So do not mix up artificial with natural. So that is natural selection, selective advantages, and how they work together. If you have any questions, please let me know.